Hello everyone, and finally welcome back to another art history lecture. So it is finally 2024. Happy New Year everyone, and it is finally break for me, which means the trials of fall semester have finally ended. And even though it's been 3 weeks into winter break, I still have not published a video essay as I would have hoped. I think it's because currently I am trying to plan and work on a very funny and very special video that I've been wanting to do for a very long time, even before I had my channel. It's something very special to me, and I guess I'm just having a lot of difficulty trying to figure out how I want to plan it or structure it or edit it because I want it to be really good. Like, this is something I've been wanting to do for so long, and when I finally make it, it has to be perfect. Like, I can't fuck up. I would honestly consider, no spoilers, but I would consider this art piece to be an absolute cultural icon, l'icône culturelle, but it's taking me a while. So this is just kind of a buffer so I can get one out at least before I make it before the end of break. But speaking of cultural icons, today's artist I will be talking about today was absolutely a cultural icon. The 60s and 70s abstract expressionist movement as a black female artist who story told through quilt making. I'm just gonna give a quick preface as to why I think quilt making is so important and such a essential medium, especially when it comes to narrating and storytelling. And textile art in general is this is something I go over actually in my Judith Scott video, who was very famous, important, neurodivergent textile artist. So you can go watch that if you haven't. But essentially, quilting and textile art have been intertwined with women's history ever since history has begun, kind of serving as a canvas that reflects the intricacies of femininity and richness of the female perspective that have long been oppressed or kind of restricted from being publicly shown. Historically, these art forms have always been a domain for women to express their creativity and share stories and preserve their cultural heritage in a way that is very distinctly feminine. In many cultures, the skills and techniques kind of used to quilt make and textile work are always passed down from mother to daughter through the female generations. And these crafts are often serving as this quiet yet very powerful form of communication and expression in these times where their voices are often repressed, like I said. Quilting as a physical practice itself was always often done collectively as a group. It was usually pretty abnormal for you to quilt alone. Usually you do it in groups with your friends where you can gossip and storytell and kind of share little tidbits of your personal life as you quilt and sew together. I just find this personally very important because if there's something I would want everyone to know about me is that I am very adamant about the essentiality and importance of physical community spaces. This is kind of a sidetrack, but I've kind of worked in museums my whole life ever since the beginning of high school because not only am I a huge history fan, I mean, as you can tell, I'm a huge art history fan, I'm an anthropology major, political economy major, but with everything so online and the digital age kind of removing these barriers of physical enclosures, there's kind of a less emphasis put on physical presence nowadays. And that's why whenever I do work or I want to participate in a project or even it's like a job that I'm getting paid for, I always make sure there's some aspect of community building and kind of, it doesn't necessarily have to be cultural, but just preservation of a physical community space that is kept open. So the last summer I was actually able to work in Koreatown with a nonprofit, and at the end of the year, it was like this project we had done. It was an actually art community exhibit in Koreatown. And the theme was Mothers of Koreatown. And we wanted to reflect all these varying and multidimensional perspectives of immigrant motherhood. And one of the pieces actually donated to us was one of the main centerpieces. I'll include an image of it. Was donated by Katrina Wong. I believe she is an actress based in Los Angeles. And she donated this huge 6-foot square quilt. And it was so beautiful, it was so intricate. You could tell every patch had its own personal memo. And it was actually quilted together by her mother and other elderly women who lived at the same senior care facility center as her. And together, this huge quilt made this beautiful composition of a totality of narration between these immigrant elderly Asian women. And I guess this was kind of a very long preface to quilt making, but like I said, I just find this medium so special and important to my heart, especially for this act of community building and narration. And as an artist, the artist we'll be talking about today, Faith Ringgold, who was also an activist and a children's author, kind of challenged these perceptions of the African American identity in the 60s and 70s and gender inequality through her quilts and her art for over 5 decades. She was able to use her quilts to kind of personalize her narratives and history and politics to tell her story and her identity as an African American woman. Her technique and a lot of the mediums she used throughout her life as an artist kind of positioned her work more in the sector of folk art, I would say, rather than European fine art. And like I said, even though quilt making is regarded in so many various cultures universally, it's really important that Ringgold especially used quilt making as a medium, especially as a political activist, because she really uses it to recall its historical role, especially during times when chattel slavery in the US were still legal and during the Civil War. I'm sure you learned in your elementary or middle school history class, the Underground Railroad and these Quakers used quilts as symbols of hope or resilience or messages to get directions to somewhere for slaves trying to escape. I think an author who puts it quite perfectly is Florence Barnett Cash, who is a professor of Americana Studies and History at the State University of New York, Stony Brook. Female slaves would get together in the evenings or on Saturday afternoons to spin, weave, and sew. A former slave recalled that her mother worked in the field all day and pieced quilts all night. African American women recycled cloth as a means of survival. They designed their quilts to accommodate the scraps and rags which were available to them. Enslaved women exchanged old blankets and thick cloth amongst themselves. And before I delve straight into Ruth's life and history and background, I feel like I've kind of noticed this emerging trend of newer contemporary artists wanting to explore mediums in handcraft and physical work rather than means of European fine art and painting. And I think the art world's recent enthusiasm for textiles, ceramics, and these other physical mediums. This interest kind of provides a firm anchor against this constantly rapidly changing world. Even in the art world, media trends just move so fast. You don't even know what's technically trending or what's popular because everything is technically trending and everything can be technically popular all at once. We're in the digital world where we're literally in this panopticon and you can see everything all at once. So I guess in the art world, in this age where there's this free fall feeling of social media, I would say these physical handiworks like textile, ceramics, this actual labor device of art kind of anchors us and kind of physically, is able to give us something to believe in, which is a very loose metaphor, and I feel like I kind of poorly explained this, but I don't know, that's just a personal thought I was having. So Faith Ringgold was born Faith Willie Jones in New York City in the Harlem neighborhood of Manhattan. She grew up in Harlem during the Great Depression, but it's surprising because if you actually analyze her artworks and art, they evoke a sense of warmth and comfort and familial yearning rather than deprivation or struggle. I love that she's able to kind of storytell and recall her memory through this perspective of gratitude and recount these beautiful cultural wonders, even though the time period that she lived through is historically, objectively, a very awful and gruesome time for most, especially Harlem. So I guess it makes sense that quilts inherit associations with warmth and comfort and family, maybe your grandma. And the tactility that she uses is able to conjure and evoke these feelings of warmth and community that she felt in her Harlem neighborhood growing up that we can genuinely feel as we view her quilts and her artwork. Her mother was also a fashion designer and seamstress and encouraged Faith's creative pursuits from a very early age, which led her to pursue a bachelor's degree from City College of the City University of New York in 1955. And after that, she taught art in public schools in New York and worked on a master's degree at City College. Exploring what it meant to be an African American artist for Ringgold, she quotes, "I found my artistic identity and personal vision in the 60s by looking at African masks, and my art form through serial paintings of Jacob Lawrence." I would say this is really important because it isn't really widely known that the powerful geometry and symmetry of African masks can be argued as a very essential factor in evolving and impacting the modernism movement in painting, but it did. And even Picasso talks about it all the time, that these African tribal masks are honestly such a huge factor in influencing his artwork and geometry and jagged modernist shapes of his work. And nobody really talks about it that much, or it's not really brought that much to people's attention. Ringgold started off in the painting medium, and she began painting oil paintings and posters that began in the mid to late 1960s, and always carried and evoked very strong political messages in support of the civil rights movement. In 1968, she actually co-founded the Ad Hoc Women's Art Committee with a fellow art critic and historian, Lucy Lippard, to protest and exhibit at the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York. And this was an exhibition where they had publicly stated that no woman, no black artists were to be included in this exhibition. To protest, the group left eggs in the Whitney, and Ringgold came up with the idea of each member blowing a whistle to repeatedly disrupt the exhibition and the announcement of the show. Another really popular, very politically charged oil painting she did in the 1960s was Mr. Charlie in 1964. And in this painting, you can see it's a very mature, white, American businessman, kind of looking a little bit scarily at you in the eye, and he's kind of very forcefully depicted in bold colors and hard edges and very simplified shapes. And in the painting, you can see that his hand is actually held over his heart, and he stares ahead with a very blank and condescending expression at you. His vacant expression is something to be kind of thought of as someone who is so fixated on his own subjective perspective that it cannot be possible for him to feel empathy and look beyond at other people's perspectives. His figure is kind of almost feels awkwardly shoved into the canvas. His body just seems to be too large to be encaptured in the bounds of a simple canvas, and possesses this very looming kind of intimidance. And I would say the two-dimensionality of this painting kind of suggests that this is not one specific person. It can't be, it's lack of dimension. It's rather a type of person than a very specific individual with feelings or empathy. In the early 1970s, Ringgold actually abandoned traditional painting altogether, and instead Ringgold kind of began making these unstretched acrylic paintings on canvas with very lush fabric borders, like those of Tibetan Tangas. And Tangas are painted on canvas, and this canvas is strung on a bamboo frame, which is then stretched onto a frame of wood itself, and it actually roughly translates to recorded message. Tanga is usually used in a form of Buddhist art that was usually used as a teaching and meditation tool used amongst monks and religious scholars. Ringgold, in this period when she quit oil painting, actually started to work with her mother, Will Posey, a lot more as well, and started to use mediums and craft tools such as raffia. The raffia palms are a genus that is specific to the native and tropical regions of Africa, and you can make ribbon from it, like a very specific type of thread. And I think this is when she really starts to delve into specifically using her cultural and political identity as a medium rather than just a form of expressive art. Echoes of Harlem was the first quilt that she made together with her mother, and it features a depiction of 30 residents in Harlem. And it's initially painted in a grid system, and the faces appear gazing from various angles set off from each other by a rectangular shaped quilt work in the border. This combination of modern and old quilt making techniques is very reminiscent of screen printing, I would say, if you have ever screen printed like a t-shirt or something. And the replication of images I am guessing is also very reminiscent and influenced by the pop art movement going on during this time, like with Andy Warhol. And with the use of this very predominantly blue background, Ringgold kind of creates a sense of a very harmonious and diverse community. The racial differences, I would say, can be demonstrated by the contrasting of colors within the portrait squares. And I think this kind of overall contrast but blending effect kind of represents Harlem as a whole and how she sees it and how she acknowledges this immense various diversity that makes up Harlem, but it is still considered this one united forefront of a community. One of her best known works, or her best known quilts, is actually Tar Beach, and it is the first quilt in her Woman on a Bridge series about a young African American girl growing up in Harlem. And the story quilt, the first one, depicts a family spending time outdoors on the rooftop or tar beach of their apartment building. The scene is bordered by fabric squares, many of them with very floral-like patterns, and at the top and bottom of the quilt there is actually text inscribed kind of telling the girl's story. At the top left, the story begins, and it writes, "I will always remember when the stars fell around me and lifted me above the George Washington Bridge. Sleeping on Tar Beach was magical. Only 8 years old, and in 3rd grade I can fly. That means I'm free to go wherever I want for the rest of my life." Her use of color in this specific piece and repetitive floral motif creates kind of like this very garden-like border and sense of greenery in a city like New York City, where it is very urban and it's very rare to see natural botanical plants growing. And by adopting this very native and folk technique to her quilt making in this piece, where her work is being expressed very directly and freely, it can definitely be assumed that this is coming from very internal depth and a very internal character for herself, and is very personal to her own life. She said of this series very interestingly, quote, "My women are actually flying. They are just free, totally. They take their liberation by confronting this huge masculine icon, the bridge." Faith Ringgold still today is one of the most influential cultural figures of her generation, with a career linking all these very multidisciplinary practices together, the Harlem Renaissance, and influencing still today these very political young contemporary black artists working, such as Bisa Butler and Don Williams Boyd, who are also two black artists who use quilt making as their kind of main contemporary medium. Later in her life, Ringgold actually moved on to become a professor at the university. Later in life, Ringgold actually became a professor at the University of California, San Diego, up until 2002. Beginning in the 1990s, Ringgold also actually embarked on a literary career, and she published her first ever children's book, Tar Beach, named after her first very famous quilt, obviously. And I believe at this point she has written and illustrated over 15 children's books. In recognition of her contributions to America's cultural life as an activist and an artist, she has received a countless number of awards, such as the National Endowment for the Arts Award and a Guggenheim Fellowship for Painting and an NAACP Image Award. To wrap it up, Faith Ringgold is more than just an artist. She was a storyteller. She was this kind of role model for paving the way for this medium and very cultural, impactful medium of quilt making, and she was a cultural icon. Through her vibrant quilts, she has kind of woven together stories of struggle, resilience, and hope, all while breaking barriers through with her identity as an African American woman in the art world. And her legacy is a very vivid tapestry of African American history, gender equality, and artistic innovation. I think I've been researching so many female artists lately that have been textile artists or quilt makers like Faith Ringgold, and it's really inspired me to kind of buy my own loom. And I don't mean those huge industrial ones that cost like $3,000. I'm talking about the very small ones from like Michael's and Joann's Crafts, because I've just seen, like I said, there's just this like re-emergence of textile art and looming and weaving that I think I would really enjoy, and I'm someone who usually delves into new things even if I don't really pursue them for a while very easily. So I think I'm gonna buy a loom. But with that being said, thank you so much for watching if you made it to the end of the video, And like I say at the end of all my videos, I hope you learned something from this or took something from it or even gained inspiration from it to create your own art or your own textile work or just express yourself in a creative manner, because that's all I hope to do with this channel. But thank you so much again, and I hope to see you at my next video, which will absolutely be the very personal, important piece I was talking about before the end of winter break. Thank you for watching. Bye!